Well, we are at a very significant point in our consideration of the journey of the bride, the pathway to intimacy and authority. And it's that point in the journey where the commitments that we've made to go deep, to trust the King in his wisdom, to submit ourselves to his plan. We've gazed on the things that it cost him to bring us to this place in our journey. But there comes a significant point in the journey where we are actually invited to live out what we have made a commitment to do. In the Song of Solomon, it's the Shulamite who has said, I will make my way to that mountain of myrrh, that place of embracing the sufferings of Jesus to share with him so that we might be glorified with him. She says, I will make my way to the hill of frankincense. I'll embrace the life of prayer that will give me the strength to endure the season of testing. And at the end of chapter 4 in the Song of Solomon, she's come to the place where she says, let the winds blow. Let the north wind of adversity come. Let the south wind of blessing come. My priority now is not the sustaining of my comfort zone, but to command the circumstances that will allow the maximum fragrance of worship and thanksgiving, the maximum fragrance of trust to flow forth from my heart to the heart of the King. And it's at that point that we come in chapter 5 of the Song of Solomon to that place that really every believer has to come to, that place where we actually live out the commitments that we've made, where we are actually put to the test. You know, I've been a sports fan for many years, and it's always that reality of taking the team or the individual and putting them in front of the opponent in a real situation. Paul writes about it in the New Testament where he says, look, I don't fight as though I'm a boxer beating the air. In other words, I'm not shadow boxing. I'm fighting against real opponents, the real opponent of my own soul that wants to keep things comfortable, and the real spiritual opponents that come against us in our journey to participate with the King in his authority and in his power. And so the Shulamite in chapter 5 of Song of Solomon, she's at a place of rest. She says, I slept, but my heart was awake. Her heart is alive with the words, the promise, the beauty of the King, and she's ready to engage in whatever it is. And there comes a knock on her door. She says, it is the voice of my beloved. It's so important to understand that it is the voice of the King that is inviting her out into this dark night experience. It's going to be a night of testing, a night of examining the commitments that she's made, the reality of her soul, whether she's going to be unoffended and lovesick, or whether she will abandon her trust, whether she will turn away from her confidence in the ways of her King and submit to a different kind of thing. And so she hears the voice of the King, and he speaks to her, and he says, come out with me, my beloved, my precious one. Come with me into the night. My head is covered with the drops of the night, my hair, my locks with the dew of the nighttime. And it's a prophetic picture of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, embracing that night of sorrows, that night of intercession and wrestling with his own soul, wrestling with the enemy that gave him the strength when the angels came and strengthened him to endure what was going to befall him on the cross in his death and in his resurrection. And so the Shulamite arises. It's the voice of her beloved. She knows it is he that is speaking to her. And she wrestles with herself a little bit. She says, I've already put off my old clothes and my old shoes. And it's like she's having a battle with her own soul. Because the old clothing in that passage, I believe, speaks of her old clothing of compromise. Remember, at the end of chapter 2, he invited her out to dance on the mountaintops with him. And she said, I can't go. It was the clothing of compromise. Her walk was compromised by fear. And she's put that off now because of what he paid for her, what it cost him to bring her into this situation, the commitments that she's made. There comes a time when our yes has to actually become something that we do, where obedience is lived out in the crucible of that present life situation. This is her moment. And so she says, I'm not going to put those clothes on again. I'm not going to dress myself in compromise. And simultaneous things happen. The king puts his hand on the latch of the door. He says, I'm going to open the door for you to come out and join me in this nighttime of sorrows. And she puts her hand forth to open the door and go out into the night with him. You know, it's a picture of the anointing that comes to us in the moment where we need the grace to embrace that night of sorrows. She says, when I put my hand on the latch, liquid myrrh was poured out upon my fingers. And it's a picture. Myrrh, remember, was the anointing oil for burial. It's the preparatory anointing for a season of dying to ourselves, embracing that night of sorrows. And so when she puts her hand to the latch, when she's actually making the decision to say yes, the grace comes to endure that moment. You know, some years ago, I had the opportunity to speak to a group of Korean missionaries that had gone to difficult places in the earth, places that it's dangerous to preach the gospel, where they accepted the assignment to go to these various places in Eastern Bloc countries, in the Middle East, where their lives could very well be in danger simply for preaching the gospel. And one woman asked the question. She said, I'm not sure I will have what it takes to withstand if the choice would actually come to give my life for the gospel. And I shared this passage with her. I said, you know, the grace that you need for that moment isn't there today because you don't need it today. But when you respond to the invitation of the King, when you put your hand on that latch of the door, then that grace will come upon you in that moment to stand in faith in what Jesus is inviting you to do. The Shulamite does that. She opens the door. She goes out anticipating a night of sweet communion with the King. And the surprising thing is he's withdrawn once again. That strategic withdrawal that leaves us seemingly in the moment by ourselves, not really by ourselves because he's promised not to leave us or forsake us, but where we can't seem to access his immediate presence in that moment to find the grace to stand. And she goes out, she looks for him, he's not there, she calls him, he doesn't answer, and she goes out to search for her beloved one in that night season at his invitation. It's so important to remember here that the trouble she's about to encounter is because she's being obedient to him. Her first night of trouble, that dark night, was a night of compromise. This is the dark night of obedience, and it's very different because her heart is in full cooperation with the invitation of the King to come out into that dark night. And he is orchestrating this moment as he has for his saints throughout history so that her faith can shine, so that she will be exhibited as one who is qualified to receive intimacy and authority as her reward. She goes out into the night and she encounters the watchmen, these spiritual overseers of the city, and they are charged with her well-being. They are to keep watch over the city. But in this situation, it's as though they don't comprehend what she's doing. They believe that she's on some kind of adventure that is not legitimate. And so they take her, they capture her, and the text says they beat her and they bruise her and they wound her and they take her veil away from her. That's such a powerful picture of the resistance of the faithful that has happened again through history. Joseph's brothers were the patriarchs of Israel, and yet it was their resistance that propelled Joseph into the place of authority that God had for him. It was the resistance of the New Testament leaders of the Jewish religion. It was their resistance that propelled Jesus into the place where his sacrifice would be sufficient for us. We read that in Acts chapter 4, that God had ordained that season. And so he does for the Shulamite. They abuse her. They take away her veil. In other words, they rip away her covering, and as it were, they tear her flesh with resistance. It's so significant because in Hebrews chapter 10, we read that there was another veil that was torn. It was torn in the temple at the crucifixion of Jesus. And we read in Hebrews chapter 10 that that veil was the veil of his flesh. that when Jesus' flesh was torn, there was a way opened up into the Holy of Holies. He was the doorway. That was the way that was opened up. The veil in the temple was torn at that moment. And the symbol of that was the real tearing of the flesh of Jesus that opened up the presence of the Father to us, the glory realm, the beauty of holiness in the presence of the Father. And so she endures this, and she comes through that moment with an unoffended and lovesick heart. As she's faced the resistance of her leaders, but yet with a pure heart, a heart of obedience, the first thing that she encounters is the daughters of Jerusalem. And they say, basically, what has happened to you? And her first words out of her mouth was, oh, my friends, if you find my beloved, tell him that I am lovesick. In other words, she's come through that terrifying, unexpected, dark night, lovesick and unoffended. Rather than being offended and heartsick, she has chosen to gaze on the sufferings of her king, what it cost him to bring her to that place. That verse in Hebrews chapter 12 where it says, consider him who endured such things so that in your moment of testing you will not grow weary and lose heart. And they say to her, who is this man that you would answer us in such a way? What is he like? And her response is, I believe something like this, oh, you obviously haven't seen him. And in a coming section, we'll talk about the beauty of the king that is revealed to her as she is obedient in that difficult night of testing, where God's purpose is to exhibit her as a daughter who is worthy to stand with this king, a fit and suitable bride for his perfect son.